This is One Universe at a Time. I'm Brian Koberlein. If you're a sports fan, you're probably familiar with the statistics of your favorite players. And those aren't just for fun. They can also be used to determine how strong a team is, or perhaps even to make money, as in the movie Moneyball. On our show today is Dr. Matt Hoffman, Assistant Professor of Mathematics at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and he's going to talk to us about the statistics of sports. I am not a big sports fan, so I'm roughly familiar with some of these statistics. When you look at these, what type of statistics do you think are important, and how do you use them?
Really is going to depend somewhat on the sport you're looking at. We got into this talking because we just hosted a big hockey analytics conference on campus. But really, most of the things that people are interested in, statistics have been around in sports and been very popular for a long time. It's just sort of more recently, people have been trying to dive deeper into really parsing the statistics and trying to figure out how to really use them to determine the true worth of individual players, right? And that's sort of the holy grail in the analytics, looking at the sports, is trying to figure out how to actually quantify, put a number on how valuable somebody has been.
Right, based on their statistics.
Based on their statistics. And people have always been looking at stats. You mentioned Moneyball. Baseball is sort of where most of this started. Statistics are a really important part of baseball. There's so many, these big numbers that people care about, 500 home runs and 20 strikeouts in a game. Baseball is the sport of numbers. And people have been looking at this for a while. It's just that the numbers that people are looking at, have been sort of transitioning, and there's been a real speed up over the past, 15 years, 20 years, longer maybe in baseball, but hockey, is maybe the last 10 to 15 years of people trying to figure out what's important, right? Baseball pitchers is a classic example, because you talked about a pitcher and the Cy Young Award winner was always winning 20 games, right? You hit 20 games, suddenly you were the best pitcher. You were worthy of awards, but you had a great season. And if you won 11 games, you did not have a great season. Mm-hmm. But as people looked into it more, they were actually able to show in the statistics that, in fact, you have less control over the amount of games that you win as people might have thought, right? So it's a great number, and we certainly like talking about someone being a winner. But when it comes down to it, you can give up one run, your team can score 0, and you're going to lose, and it's not your fault.
Right.
A lot of this people have been working on is trying to figure out what you can actually control, what you can't control, and what you can measure about how well people do the things you can control.
So this is really like trying to find the signal out of the noise.
Yeah.
And things like a lot of the statistics that we've been looking at have been noise.
Yeah. You mentioned the signal and the noise, right? This is Nate Silver's book. And Nate Silver, one of the first things he did was develop a system called Pacoda for baseball forecasting. So most of this starts with a guy named Bill James in baseball who published a book a long time ago. Mm-hmm. You talk about things like, when we're talking about pitchers, strikeouts have become more important because a pitcher actually has some control about strikeouts. One of the interesting things in baseball that people have found is that once the ball's in play, you really don't have a lot of control over it for the most part. Now, there's some sort of, if you give up a lot of ground balls versus a lot of fly balls, in general, you think of, a really good pitcher is going to have people have less hits, but for the most part, once the ball's in play, it's largely out of your control, right? Besides, there's defense that can affect it and things like that. So in hockey, for example, right, one of the big things that was done early on was people looking at things like shooting percentages and save percentages. And for the most part, those are fairly standard. So more and more people have been trying to dig into, is a specific player better at a specific type of shot or from a specific location? But one of the first stats that was really popular in hockey was, you'll see it as PDO, and it's basically just adding up your shooting percentage as a team and your save percentage as a team. And the idea being, as it turns out, you don't have a ton of control over your shooting percentage and your save percentage because there's a lot of randomness that goes on. A lot of it is just
playing against any other teams, you're going to have pretty much the same no matter what.
Yeah, and there might be some underlying skill there, but over time, they sort of go to the league average. And so if you then add them together, right, they should be about 100. Mm-hmm. And if you're doing better than that, it probably means you're lucky, Right? If you're doing worse than that, it probably means that you're unlucky rather than good, at least at the NHL level. Yeah. And so this became something that people would use as a measure of trying to figure out which teams might get better or regress, right? Based on, this team did really well this year, but it looks like they got really lucky. I think they're going to do worse next year.
Right. Yeah. And that kind of brings up the thing of how people think with sports is that, when someone has a hitting streak or they're on fire, as it were, and people think, well, if they've made 3 in a row so far, that must mean something.
Yeah.
And it sounds like the statistics would say, well, no, it doesn't really mean something.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is you dig more and more into it, and I think there might have been something in basketball recently. I wish I could remember what it is, but I think I saw that actually there was some indication that there might be some sort of hot shooting at some level, I believe.
Okay.
I saw that. But yeah, I mean, and it starts sort of more general, right, at a team level, and now you're trying to dig into the individual players, right? Okay. And a lot of times you're trying to get a better feel of what you are seeing, right, to actually quantify what you're seeing, and you want the stats to agree with what you see at some level. I mean, you hope they do, right? The interesting thing is when they don't.
I see this as a good team, and I want to have the statistics.
There's still this level of having an idea of what the game is like, and if you run the stats, and a lot of players aren't very good or showing up at the top, it's probably your statistic that's wrong, right?
Okay.
You get some really interesting things when you see people talk about this. It's normally like, hey, we've got this statistic, and hey, you can see at the top, here are these 3 players. I know it's pretty well agreed that these 3 players are very, very good. Mm-hmm. Showing up right here is this player, who most people don't think is very good. So he's an interesting case because there's something about him that when you're watching, you might not see, but actually, if you run the data, this makes it seem like he's very interesting. So these players tend to be interesting, and this is sort of what Moneyball was about, was trying to find these players that most people looked at and said, right. But actually, if you ran the numbers, they were telling you that they actually were more helpful to success than you might have thought.
In an indirect way, or in a way that you wouldn't necessarily think, like someone who only bats first base.
Yes.
They never hit the home run, so their statistics are awful. But they always get onto base.
Right. And on-base percentage was one of the big things in baseball. That was one of the big things with Moneyball that first came up, was people talk about home runs, and RBIs is another category where, runs batted in, sluggers are, really good at producing runs. They have a high RBIs. You get to 100 RBIs. You've had a great year. But actually, that depends on someone being on base when you get the hit, right? So you don't have total control over that, whereas on-base percentage is something that you have a lot better control on. In hockey, the sort of most basic stat that first became popular was something called Corsi, which is actually just is shots, essentially. Because in football, you probably hear people talk about time of possession as being an indicator of success. And in hockey, the same is kind of true, right? If you have the puck, you're going to be more likely to be doing well. And the NHL never kept track of time on ice, right? And never kept track of possession. And so what people instead had to do was take a look at shots, because shots, if you have the puck, you're more likely to shoot. You're not going to shoot if you don't have the puck. So at the first order level, right, this is what people grabbed onto. They could get shots, they could get block shots, and it turned out that correlated very well with winning, right? There's only a handful of goals in a normal hockey game, so there's definitely a lot of randomness there. And so actually shots ended up being a better predictor than goals for what's going to happen in the future, because it had a lot more of an indication of what happened in the full game and the actual performance.
And it seems like part of this would depend upon the fact that now that we videotape games, we can get far more statistics than we could before. So if you go back to, baseball in the 1930s, we don't have fully recorded baseball games. So we only have the statistics that are left over.
Right. And a lot of the interesting things that are happening now come in with some of this. You've got this video, but the actual technology to parse it, really mostly manpower at this point. Some people, like in baseball, right, pitch tracks, they now have these things in the stadiums that actually measure pitch location and pitch speed. And that has allowed people to do some really cool analysis with things like trying to measure how important it is if a catcher frames the pitch, right? How much is that worth? Because you can actually see pitch locations, see what was a strike and what wasn't, and actually try to see what the effect was on the total runs that are scored.
Right.
Okay. Basketball in the NBA, in the past couple years, I think it's been 2 or 3 years, I believe, that they've actually had these camera systems installed. So they actually can track the actual locations of people on the court. Okay. And that's been really interesting because, now you have this sort of massive explosion of data and people trying to go through and figure out combinations of players, how well people are working together, how much spacing is ideal, and these sorts of things. Hockey doesn't have any of that yet, although there's been talk of doing one of these type camera systems in the NHL. It's still unclear when that would happen and if the data would be available to people outside the league. There's going to be a big boom if that ever happens in hockey. But for the most part, as I said, we just had this conference here. Most of what's being done is by the community, on Twitter, on message boards and things like that. And it's these massive efforts where people are dedicating their time to go through the video and manually mark up, specific events. And to really try to analyze this, you're really going down to a very micro level where you're, it's one thing to look at goals or shots, and now you get into every time a player carries the puck into the offensive zone. Right. What happens?
Every time they exchange it with another player.
Every time they exchange it, what happens if you're passing it into the zone versus carrying it into the zone? And we saw a woman named Jen Costella did a presentation where they've tracked it, and they actually have a stopwatch trying to time the amount of time it took a player to shoot from getting the puck, also the amount of time in the offensive zone, and actually trying to categorize these, at the tenth of a second level, these different types of movements, right, that players are doing, and which players are better or prefer to do these types of movements versus the other one, and actually trying to then sort them, classify players, right, based on the types of actions that they're doing in a typical game.
So kind of statistically determining between aggressive or passive or intermediate type of players.
Yeah, and she was classifying them into sort of players that sort of do it all, players that are sort of more content or better at making a flashy play, sort of a big sort of she said do-it-yourself players, I believe, but it's sort of a player who's more likely to sort of take a chance, maybe get a steal and get a breakaway, but less likely to participate in sort of a higher build-up play. So that's the sort of, now you're really trying to hone in on specific players and specific things that specific players are doing, which is sort of a whole new layer of depth.
I'm Brian Koberlein. You're listening to One Universe at a Time, and we're talking with Matthew Hoffman about sports statistics. So when we mention Moneyball, it seems one of the questions that comes to me would be, is this kind of ruining the sport? The idea that if we're going to overanalyze this, is it simply like the Yankees where it's the best team the money can buy?
I guess now it depends on exactly what your interest is in the game. I think there certainly are the stereotypical casual fan who says, "Oh, you're ruining my sport with all these statistics," right? Charles Barkley in the NBA, he said in one of the halftime shows something along the lines of, analytics is it's nonsense. It's this thing that's been invented by people who want to be part of the game but aren't talented athletically. Is basically the gist of what he said. So there's definitely some pushback. It's definitely been accepted in the sense that if you look at just about every single pro sports team, they now hire analytics people. I think every NHL team, except one, as far as I know, employs statisticians, analytics people at some level. The amount of money they spend on that versus other things, who knows? But so from a professional level, I think it's been pretty well accepted that there are useful things you can do. And again, all it takes is finding one player who you sign as a free agent, or one player who you don't sign as a free agent, who you shouldn't have, and suddenly you've saved yourself millions of dollars, right? So there's a potential high return on investment from a business perspective of these teams. In terms of watching it, I think that as a big sports fan myself, I enjoy it, right? I like hearing all of these things.
Says the mathematician
who likes sports. Yes. I think it's really fun, and I think it makes the post-game stuff a lot more interesting, because I guess the other way to think about it, actually, some of the writing and talking that goes on gets a little bit more frustrating, because you hear things where you're like, that doesn't matter. Stop talking about that. I know that we've showed that people have showed that doesn't matter. Is one of those things that just talking about statistics or analytics sounds scarier than it often is.
Right.
And the NHL, for example, right, Corsi was this stat, and it means shots. right? NHL 2 years ago or something updated their stats pages, and they put this up, and they're not calling it Corsi anymore. They're calling it shots. And there was a corresponding stat called Fenwick, which was basically shots minus block shots. The idea being blocking a shot is a skill. I want to distinguish these at some level, but that's no longer called Fenwick on the NHL, because calling it these things makes them seem a little bit harder to deal with than you just call it shots or unblocked shots. Suddenly that makes a little bit more sense.
Right.
So I think from that level, people are trying to make it more accessible. I think it's becoming pretty well accepted that most people watching the games, you definitely see TV broadcasts and people trying to integrate it more to varying levels of effectiveness in terms of appreciating actually watching the game. It's something that certainly can get in your way if used incorrectly.
Right. It would seem like a lot of pregame discussions would be that way too. Is it when I know the statistics, you know the statistics, and I can say, well, no, see, the numbers look up. My team's going to win. Your team's going to lose, and here's why.
Well, in some ways, actually, most of this ends up being probabilistic. So it actually renders some of the discussion a little bit moot, because it's kind of it seems like whatever, this happened, it was the right decision because there was a 63% chance of success about it. Didn't work out. That just it was a bad dice roll, right? And so you end up
sitting around at the bar going, well, yeah, here's to a 35% chance of winning.
yeah exactly. So you get these, at some level, I think it actually, from my perspective as a sports fan, I think it helps me be a little bit less upset when my team loses and they did things intelligently, right?
Right.
It's helped me, following it a little bit more, it's helped me say as a fan, oh, we lost, but
they're still 45%
they did well.
good.
Well, yeah, but it wasn't that my team is terrible necessarily, right?
They're only 25%
They did a lot of things,
terrible.
and it happened that, the low probability thing came out.
Right.
I agree. I find conversations with friends and family often being more like, well, I understood that decision. I think that was the right decision. It didn't work out. I can't be too upset about it. And maybe some of that's getting older, more mature or whatever is happening. But I think some of it is having a better understanding and seeing what's going on with all of the statistics for the most part.
And do you think it would be the case, and then if as teams start accepting this more, as teams start implementing this more, do you think it will foster kind of more competition? Like in baseball, when people talk about the Yankees, it's like, oh yeah, of course the Yankees won, because but it's not a fun game to watch.
Not recently.
Not recently. But if you have this one team that dominates, and then all the other teams are kind of secondary.
Yes,
it's not really entertaining.
There's certainly been some questioning of, for example, with Moneyball, the A's were this low budget club, right, a smaller market club, and they were able to find some of these guys who were undervalued in the market, right? And they were able to employ them, and they won a bunch of AL West division titles. Now, they never won the World Series, right? They always lost in the playoffs, right? This was happening in the late 90s, I think. And then, right, the Red Sox have the money. They employed some staff, but they actually employed Bill James, who was one of the, and a front office that really, really liked statistics. Now they win the World Series, right? So there's this issue of, if you can combine them, suddenly the A's advantage isn't quite as big as it used to be, unless, of course, you can develop either a better statistic that helps you quantify something that someone else did. But the other aspect is there's sort of a economics business side of this, which is, you want to put a value on things, and you also want to see what the market value is. And that's a part of this. I mean, we've been starting to just very, very beginning phases of trying to work with RIT's hockey team here. They've got a great program. It was a really fun thing that we thought we could have student interest in, try to get involved at the college level doing some of this analytics for the hockey team here. And it's been interesting because you read about a lot of this stuff, and a lot of the pro sports metrics are based upon how much is a player worth. Because the real issue is, how much is it worth paying that player for what they're giving you?
Right, because it all comes down to the money.
Yeah, because it all comes down to the money. Now, that's not really an issue in college. I'm not going to make any Division I jokes, actually. But so that's not an issue. So it's sort of a different
But the athletes
thing.
aren't professional athletes. They
Right,
can't be paid under the college guidelines.
Yeah, so that's the thing. So it's a slightly different thing because the focus is mostly on the economics. In a lot of these sports, you're trying to come up with one number, and what people are generally trying to quantify is how many wins did a player get, are they worth, right? And then how much money is a win worth, and now you have a value on the player.
You're listening to One Universe at a Time. I'm Brian Koberlein, and we're talking with Matthew Hoffman about sports statistics. So you talked about how a lot of these statistics are gathered by hands, by hobbyists, and you kind of said in passing about how they may be setting up some of these cameras in hockey, but you're not sure whether or not they're going to release this publicly. As you've gotten experience with gathering these statistics, are there any types of statistics that you'd love to get but can't get?
I personally would love to get the data that actually has player locations on the ice, because I think it would be really neat to do some, to look at these sort of learning algorithms. Now you can actually look at spacing. Now you can look at player location with respect to everyone else. Because most of the time when people are tracking, you can really track the player with the puck. You can track a pass, you can track a shot. Almost nobody is tracking more than essentially that. And people do look at some of these microstats, like one thing that people have talked about, offense, right? You can measure in shots at some level, and because they relate to goals. Defense is harder. Goaltending is probably even harder. Having an idea of how to measure those, no one's really figured out great ways to do it so far. But one thing on defense, right, that I've seen people look at is you can look at the defender, and you can look at when an offensive player is bringing the puck towards them, right? You can look at the spacing, you can look at their positioning, and try to get a sense of what they are doing to either push back or give them space to it. So you can look at these sort of space-based things. So people have tried to track some of these things by hand, where I'm looking at the player bringing the puck, I'm looking at the defender, and I'm trying to get a sense for how much space they're giving them, right? But if you have actual tracking for all the players on the ice, suddenly you really get a sense for what's happening there. I think some of the defensive metrics might be able to be developed a lot better, which would be really nice. And from the offensive end, I think just having a sense of the spacing of the whole team, things like shots with different number of players in front of the net, what the advantages is to that, those sorts of things, actually being able to look at the full picture of what's happening, and make conclusions from that, and actually being able to have a database of all of these different shots, but not just the shot, but everyone on the ice at the time of the shot, right? And really being able to go through this database to make predictions about what would happen in the future, I think is sort of the really, really exciting thing that could happen there. I'm hopeful that maybe we can actually do some of that here down the road if things go well, because we do have some good engineering and imaging science and things like that it would make a natural project at some point. From a goalkeeping perspective, technology similar to the pitch track stuff in baseball, where you actually have sort of speed and locations pinpointed. Right.
Know how the puck is moving, where it's moving, how fast it's moving.
Yeah. Right. And also from a shooting perspective, I mean, if you're able to track that better, maybe you could have a better idea of what the actual skill is of the offensive players with their shots, right? If you're measuring more than just shooting percentage. The NHL has experimented with putting chips in the puck. That's something that they did a long time ago with that ill-fated Fox Puck Tracks system. It went away, and it came back. They played around with it in the All-Star game last year, and they were thinking about implementing it. I believe what happened is it costs like $200 to put a chip in. The NHL says they like being able to, if a puck goes in the stands, the fan can keep it, or someone gives it to a fan, and it's a puck. If it's a $200 chip puck, this is now a problem. So, from a sort of PR and fan friendliness, that's one of their stated reasons why they're not doing it right now.
Now, this is all in many ways scientific data. I mean, this is what you're talking about. Do you think this stuff should be kind of open access? Do you think it ought to be available to the general public, or do you think teams ought to be able to have their own rights to their data?
I really would like to have it all available, but I don't think I could come up with a good. After all, they're still business.
They're still a business.
I can't really say that there's any reason that they should release everything that they have. But it would be nice if the NHL had some of this at a league level. Release some of these, at least some things. Maybe they'd be able to keep some things as proprietary, but if they're really able to do it. But I mean, at some level, most of these are the teams installing things in their own arenas that they own. So far as I can tell, the only real argument I would have is that if the arena was taxpayer funded, then maybe I can have some argument to releasing it. But in general, I mean, I most of them would probably be foolish if they released all of their data.
Right. Well, they might release it like after they have the team decisions when they make their picks. And then release data from 2 years ago. Or
yeah, they could. Although still, just having that database over time is a big advantage, right? I mean, a lot of this is just about data. I mean, that's the thing. Just collecting the most data and how well you can do it. And most of the big advances have been just how are we able to get more data, more accurate data, different data that we had in the past. And once you have the data, then there's so many things you can do with it. So it sounds like even if they implement all of this stuff, you're still going to be dependent upon people looking at the videos hand by hand. Yeah, that might be it for a while. It's interesting. There's, I can't remember if I mentioned this yet or not. 2 years ago, it was a big deal because a lot of the people who had been working on this hockey stuff for a long time, and I've only gotten into this very recently. Mm-hmm. A lot of them, or at least a small number of them, were hired by NHL teams as consultants a couple years ago. Right. And then last summer, a few more were hired. So a lot of these people who have been doing this are actually now employed, and so we had a few of these that are a bunch of people at our conference who are consulting or have consulted for NHL teams. So it's interesting hearing them discuss the experiences or be slightly more cagey with data and things like that. One of the things that was discussed at the conference was this sort of idea of thinking into the future about what might be there, whether or not you have it, right? As an individual, might a team have it? And thinking about what you could do with data that you might not have yet, but might be there down the line. Yeah. So trying to get ahead of the data that might be there, I think is a really... So you're calculating the odds of the data you might have someday. Yeah, exactly. We've been talking with Dr. Matthew Hoffman, Assistant Professor of Mathematics at the Rochester Institute of Technology, about sports statistics. Our program is produced by Mark Gillespie at the Rochester Institute of Technology with support from the RIT College of Science. I'm your host, Brian Koberlein. Thanks for listening to One Universe at a Time.